Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in the Harvard Classics Lectures. We now turn to lecture 109 from Thoreau's Walden, chapter 10. We're working now with Baker Farm, from Thoreau as naturalist, we might argue, in chapter 9, to Thoreau as theologian here in chapter 10, and then we'll argue in chapter 11, Thoreau as mystic. There are many who have seen the heart of the pond, if you wish to call it that, the book, the poem, as I've often referred to it here, as being the chapters 9, 10, and 11. Certainly, we're going to be more challenged, I think, than in any other part of the poem with these ideas. Now, the assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net in the Harvard Classics folders, especially lectures 99 through 108, although honestly, to be able to really study chapters 9, 10, and 11 of Walden, you need a pretty good understanding of Emersonian transcendental thought. We've given full lectures on most of the essays of Emerson, and it's probably not a bad idea to be conversant with those ideas, as well as, of course, our ideas that we've shared elsewhere at learnstrong.net on Plato, especially the Apology and the Republic. We've also given some lectures in the junior folder as well that might be of some help in your reading of these lines here. We also assume that you're conversant with our 3 levels of reading. At level 1, what does the text say? At level 2, what does the text mean? At 2A, themes, messages. And at 2B, this is the rhetorical level for Thoreau, not what he says, but how he says it. And we are kind of really blown away by these chapters 9, 10, and 11 here. His analysis of symbolism and allegory. He uses very much the allegorical structure that Plato will use in Republic time and time again, where he's going to set up the opposite, that is to say, the anti-example. We'll get to that in a moment. And then finally at level 3, how can I relate to this information in some meaningful way? First of all, how does it relate to other parts of the poem, Walden? And then finally, how does it relate to other texts that I know? And then finally at 3B, how can I relate this material to myself? There is no question that when one takes into, what we sometimes refer to as Thoreau's holy trinity of ideas in chapters 9, 10, and 11, you're going to be challenged. There is no question about it, no matter who you are, no matter what religion you practice or don't practice, no matter what kind of philosophic views you hold or do not hold. Thoreau's going to challenge us here, no question about it. These are, as we've said, some of the most challenging of Thoreau's ideas, and a lot of it comes down to another one of those counter-examples. In other words, the power of the negative model. Thoreau will, of course, himself represent maybe the positive model for many readers, and then Thoreau will kind of set up the counterexample, and we'll see this here. Another way to think about this is Michelangelo, as we've commented in our prior lecture, Michelangelo mentioned in chapter 9. Here in chapter 10, we're going to be with Solomon, and more particularly the Ecclesiastes chapter 12 passage, and we're going to be talking then about that notion of how is it best to live one's life. Let's quickly summarize and then jump right into some reading of the passage. Thoreau, it begins in Baker Farm with a study, we would say, in contrasts. Himself and, as we have said, John Field. Now, John Field is a man we're going to be introduced to here, and then we're going to come back to him again in chapter 11. It's as if chapters 9, 10, 11 in some ways need to be studied together. He moves from his fishing in ponds to becoming, quote-unquote, a fisher of men, of course, quoting the Gospels. John Field, a man unable in some ways maybe to get out of his animal nature. Now, one of the interesting arguments that we're going to see in 9, 10, and in 11 is that Thoreau seems to suggest that we're not born human, we're born mammalian, we're born with our animal instincts, and the challenge is to choose, and I think that's the argument Thoreau will make here, to choose to become human in some really fundamental ways, and it is in that choice that we understand his views of theodicy and of determinism and free will and all of that. He does begin, and I'm going to read them because it is a beautiful prose poem. It's a prose poem within the prose poem, which is Walden. And we are going to get some lines of poetry, by the way, as well, strict lyric poetry as well in this. But a beautiful, beautiful detail of the woods and of trees. His love of trees has been much chronicled by any number of scholars, and we're gonna see this here as well. He will identify himself sounding very much like Wordsworth in Tintern Abbey, a worshiper of the power of nature and his ability to get lost in it, a reverie, and to be aglow with perception, as he will say it. This notion of perspicacity, as we've talked about it in our Plato lectures, insight, in other words, right? The pine groves are in many ways for him just like ancient temples. And this ability for Thoreau to move between Christian theology, Hindu theology, Chinese philosophy and theology is one of the more remarkable facets, I think, of Thoreau as integral thinker. And then he talks about the familiar trees. I mean, he talks about trees the way you would talk about people who you care about, who you've enjoyed visiting with and the like. He'll describe once, standing in, quote, the very abutment of a rainbow's arch. And so Wordsworth's, my heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky. So was it when my life began? So is it now I am a man? So be it when I shall grow older, let me die. The child is father of the man, and I could wish my days to be bound each to each by natural piety. Lines such as that certainly stand behind this glorification of the power of a single rainbow to kind of awaken in him some way. He says he's bathed joyfully in this lake of light. He says that he feels like a dolphin. And of course, the fact that he's mentioning rainbows inevitably leads us to the story of Noah, and of course the conclusion of that story in the Hebrew Bible, and the power of a rainbow as a symbol, right? Then the scene will alter. All of a sudden we've got a rain shower. He ends up in this home of an Irishman named John Field, and it's not a very nice home at all. It's certainly not ordered and neat. We think about Jordan Peterson's Clean Up Your Room, and in many ways Peterson is just referencing Thoreau when he plays that game, because Thoreau's going to have some problems with the way Field lives, and he and his family. We're going to get a little history of Field, who comes to America as an Irishman. Of course, your instructor here is last name McGee, so we can appreciate very well this idea of immigrants who come to America and try and make their way. But Thoreau will have some problem with the fact that what really drives Field here to America is his desire for material wealth and the like. And of course, he doesn't have it much at all. He'll talk about the meanness, the lowness of Field's life. Part of the problem is because he says Field needs luxuries. Coffee, he mentions tea, butter, milk, beef. These are all luxuries, of course, to Thoreau that one could live without. He will try to talk to Field as if, he says, he were a philosopher, trying to challenge him to simplify his life the way we heard about it in chapter 2, of course, of the poem. But, of course, he says Field cannot understand at all what's being said. It takes us back to the opening lines of Plato's Republic. How can we hear if we refuse to listen? Or Christ's lines, he that has ears to hear, let him hear. Field has no capacity to be able to understand what is being said. Thoreau, however, it will leave as the rain has stopped. He is like a child running down the meadow towards the pond. We're told down the hill, quote, toward the reddening west, with the rainbow over my shoulder, this reddening west. We can't help but think of Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian and all of that as well, right? He says the good genius within him, urging him to, quote, fish and hunt far and wide day by day. And of course, this is both literal as well as metaphoric. And then obviously to remember God, to grow wild, to shun trade, to enjoy the land, but never to own it. And then in the final paragraph, and we'll read it, he comes back to John Field. In this comparison, he calls him a poor man, born to be poor, not to rise in this world. A man impoverished, obviously, spiritually, as even far more than anything materially. Now, this is, of course, going to be Thoreau at some of his prose poem best, in my regards. I mean, it's hard for me to choose what parts of Walden I like the best. I've always been asked this question, and I'll always say I love the part of Walden I'm reading at the time as my favorite, and so for the time being, Baker Farm's opening lines will become my favorite from the poem. He says it this way: sometimes I rambled to pine groves. Now, rambled in his essay Walking, he calls it sauntering, and these are fun representations of the way he thinks of walking. Sometimes I ramble to pine groves, standing like temples or like fleets at sea, full rigged with wavy boughs and rippling with light, so soft and green and shady that the dryads would have forsaken their oaks to worship in them. It's not lost on us that he uses the word worship, and we will be in the middle of this notion of worship and what it means all the way through chapters 9, 10, and 11. It is Thoreau who points out that the word religion only means to repeat again and again. You can brush your teeth religiously. It will mean something far different, of course, in this notion of worship and the holding of the sacred, the awakening to the sacred, the mindfulness and all of that. He says, to the cedar wood beyond Flint's Pond, where the trees covered with hoary blueberries, spring higher and higher, are fit to stand before Valhalla. So, of course, now he's representing a whole nother esoteric system of the Norsemen. And the creeping juniper covers the ground with reeds full of fruit, or the swamps where the Usna lichen hangs in festoons from the white spruce trees, and toadstools, round tables of the swamp gods cover the ground, and more beautiful fungi adorn the stumps like butterflies or shells, vegetable wrinkles. And then there's a semicolon to break up this. If you want to be a great writer, we've said this many times in 3-3, you got to study great writers, and you'll notice the way in which Thoreau will use commas and semicolons to continue the beauty of the ideas that he's playing with. He says, where the swamp pink and dogwood grow, the red elderberry glows like eyes of imps, waxwort groves and crushes the hardest woods in its folds, and the wild holly berries make the beholder forget his home with their beauty, and he's dazzled and tempted by nameless other wild forbidden fruits. We obviously think of he's describing Eden, right, with this whole notion of forbidden fruits. We go back to our comments on Milton's Paradise Lost. So fair for mortal taste. That's an entire line, by the way. Instead of calling on some scholar, he says, I paid many a visit to particular trees of kinds which are rare in this neighborhood, standing far away in the middle of some pasture or in the depths of a wood or swamp or on a hilltop. It's not unusual for Thoreau to ask you what's your favorite tree. And obviously we reference Ruthie's tree all the time right out there in the courtyard, and it becomes, of course, a symbol because of Thoreau. He reminds us trees tell us a whole lot about who we are and what we hold sacred, what we worship, what we hold to be important, right? He says, to continue, that some of the trees, such as the black birch, of which we have some handsome specimens, 2 feet in diameter, its cousin the yellow birch with its loose golden vest perfumed like the first, the beech, which has so neat a bowl and beautifully lichen painted, perfect in all its depths, of which, excerpting scattered specimens, I know but one small grove of sizable trees left in the township, supposed by some to have been planted by the pigeons that were once baited with beech nuts nearby. It is worth the while to see the silver grains sparkle when you split this wood. The bass, the hornbeam, the Celtis occidentalis, or false elm, of which we have but one well-grown, some taller mast of a pine, a shingle tree, or a more perfect hemlock than usual, standing like a pagoda. And it's significant that he uses the word hemlock and pagoda, right? These are terms that resonate for us in our study of philosophy and obviously Socrates, no question. In the midst of the woods, and many others I could mention. These were the shrines, he calls them. I visited both summer and winter. The fact that he calls it a shrine is, I think, compelling. He says, once it chanced, I stood in the very abutment of a rainbow's arch, which filled the lower stratum of the atmosphere, tinging the grass and leaves around and dazzling me as if I looked through colored crystal. It was a lake of rainbow light in which for a short while I lived like a dolphin. If it had lasted longer, it might have tinged my employments in life. That is to say, to stand in the rainbow's light. Now, whether we're going to take him at his word and literally, or, he found the end of the rainbow and all of that. The irony, of course, is that we equate that finding the end of the rainbow with the Irish, and soon we will meet our Irishmen. He says about John Field, an Irishman and his wife. He had met several children from the broad-faced boy who assisted his father at his work, and now came running by his side from the bog to escape the rain, to the wrinkled Sybil-like cone-headed infant that sat up on its father's knee as in the palaces of nobles, and looked out from its home in the midst of wet and hunger inquisitively upon the stranger, with the privilege of infancy, not knowing but it was the last of a noble line, and the hope and cynosure of the world, instead of John Field's poor starving brat. There we sat together, under the part of the roof which leaked the least, while it showered and thundered without. I had sat there many times of old before the ship was built that floated this family to America. We're told an honest, hard-working, but shiftless man, plainly, was John Field. A little bit later, a few lines later, he says, not knowing how poor a bargain the latter had made to desire wealth in America, I tried to help him with my experience, telling him that he was one of my nearest neighbors, and that I too, who came a-fishing here and looked like a loafer, was getting my living like himself, that I lived in a tight, light, and clean house, which hardly cost more than the annual rent of such a ruin as his commonly amounts to, and how, if he chose, he might in a month or two build himself a palace of his own. Not that I did not use tea, that I did not use tea, nor coffee, nor butter, nor milk, nor fresh milk, and so did not have to work to get them. Again, as I did not work hard, I did not have to eat hard, and it cost me but a trifle for my food. But as he began with tea and coffee and butter and milk and beef, he had to work hard to pay for them. And when he had worked hard, he had to eat hard again to repay the waste of his system. And so it was as broad as it was long. Indeed, it was broader than it was long, for he was discontented and wasted his life into the bargain. And yet, he had rated it as a gain in coming to America, that here he could get tea and coffee and meat every day. Now, we'll pause for a moment and point out that this is Thoreau's critique, his criticism. And of course, this can be read literally and it can be read metaphorically. If we find ourselves forever searching after the dollar, the question obviously is, why do we need so many dollars? And if the answer is because we have so many, as Thoreau will call them, luxuries, T.S. Eliot will later call them distractions, as he will say it in Burnt Norton, distracted from distraction by distraction. And I think here Thoreau is making the argument, you choose the life you live. Think about that. You choose the life you live. And in that regards, we create so much in the question of our big five: epistemology, what can you know? Ontology, who you are. Psychology, the study of the individual mind. Sociology, the study of the group. And then finally, theodicy, this last of our big five. Why do we have pain and suffering? Notice it'll be here for Thoreau, the argument, we make most of our own pain and our own suffering by unqualified desires, by making desires that are not of value. But he says he came to America for this purpose. He wanted to be able to have the luxuries, the good things of life. And it's here that now Thoreau will speak about what it means to be a true American. He says the only true America is that country where you are at liberty to pursue such a mode of life as may enable you to do without these, and where the state does not endeavor to compel you to sustain the slavery, that's a key word for him, and war, and other superfluous expenses which directly or indirectly result from the use of such things. Now, I mean, it's hard to find a more compelling line to merge with, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and endowed by their creative certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That pursuit of happiness is exactly what it is that Thoreau is arguing right here. But notice he will say that government's role is to stay out of this, sounding very much like what he will say in Civil Disobedience, another essay that we've already lectured. He said, for I purposely talked to him, John Field, as if he were a philosopher, or desired to be one. I should be glad if all the meadows on the earth were left in a wild state, if that were the consequence of men's beginning to redeem themselves. A man will not need to study history to find out what is best for his own culture. But alas, the culture of an Irishman is an enterprise to be undertaken with a sort of moral bog hoe. And, this idea that, we get to choose, we get to decide what kind of wild state we want to live in. Well, he finishes his conversation with John Field, and now he's ready to leave. And these are some of the most powerful lines in all of Walden. He says, as I was leaving the Irishman's roof after the rain, Bending my steps again to the pond, my haste to catch pickerel, he's going fishing, wading in retired meadows and slogs and bog holes and forlorn and savage places, appeared for an instant trivial to me, who had been sent to school and college. But as I ran down the hill toward the reddening west, with the rainbow over my shoulder and some faint tinkling sounds borne to my ear through the cleansed air, from I know not where, what quarter, my good genius seemed to say, go fish and hunt far and wide day by day, farther and wider, and rest thee by many brooks and hearthsides without misgiving. Remember thy Creator in the days of thy youth. And it's fascinating that he will quote the book of Ecclesiastes and Solomon, a man who will say, I tried everything and came to realize that this is the culmination of it all in the book of Ecclesiastes. Remember, he says, thy Creator in the days of thy youth. Rise free from care before the dawn and seek adventures. There are many who have said Thoreau is so great at creating these one-liners, and this is one to put on a piece of paper and put right next to the bed that you rest in. Rise free from care before the dawn and seek adventures. Let the noon find thee by other lakes, and the night overtake thee everywhere at home. There are no larger fields than these, no worthier games than may here be played. That idea of be accepting of where you are, your ability to grow where you have been planted. Again, we think of Voltaire's Candide, cultivate our own garden. Grow wild according to thy nature, like these sedges and brakes which will never become English hay. Let the thunder rumble. What if it threaten ruin to farmers' crops? That is not its errand to thee. Take shelter under the cloud while they flee to carts and sheds. Let not to get a living by thy trade be thy sport. Enjoy the land, but own it not. Now, of course, he has to be thinking of the Bhagavad Gita, the Gita passage 2. You have the right to work, but for the work's sake only. You have no right to the fruits of your labor. Desire for the fruits, but it must never be your motive in working. Never give way to laziness either. This idea, let not to get a living be thy